Hey patrons, welcome back to the second part in this tutorial series. In this part we're going to be working on doing a close-up study of some parrot feathers, and so we're going to be working again with coloured pencil and using our solvent to blend. And so in this actual reference we've got a lot of different colours, very vibrant colours, and so we're going to have to try and make the feathers look like they're layered and on top of each other. And so to get them to look 3D, we need to apply a lot of cast shadows onto the feathers below the top feathers. And so this is going to really help us to learn how to layer our feathers and make them look realistic, get all of our different contrasts in, values, all of that sort of stuff, as well as practicing more how to use the solvent to blend. So let's get straight into it with the actual colours that I'm going to be using. Firstly, we're going to be using the white Caran d'Ache just like before, and also the black Faber-Castell polychromos, but you can use the white and black from any set that you have. I'm also going to be using mainly Prismacolors for this one. For our red tones, I'm going to be using quite a lot of the poppy red. I'm also going to be using, for those darker red tones, a polychromos pencil called Indian Red. And then for our yellow values, I'm going to be using a Prismacolor pencil called Lemon Yellow. For the shadows within the yellow areas, I've got the Goldenrod again. And I've also got the Sunburst Yellow. I'm also going to be using the cadmium orange hue for those red toned areas. And I'm going to be using the Caput Mortem Violet. This is a polychromos pencil again. For our blue areas, I'm using two colours. Firstly, the Caribbean Sea and also the Denim Blue. And I have got a third blue here called the Indigo Blue for those darker shadows. For our green values within this drawing, I have got two green pencils here, Apple Green and Olive Green, both Prismacolor pencils. And I'm also going to be using a pink, and this is the Prismacolor Hot Pink. So I'm pretty sure I've said all of the ones that we're going to be using. So now let's get straight into it, and again I'm going to be working just by adding a very light base layer, and then we're going to be blending it out, just working on getting in the basic tones and shadows, not too much on all of the little details. And I'm going to start off with doing our shadows first. So I am actually going to be going in with our black, and I'm going to be using this to get in all of those really dark shadows between the feathers. Now, I'm not going to be using this black alone. Once I go and then do every single individual feather, I will be glazing like blues and red tones and orange tones and green tones over the top of the blacks, wherever's necessary with that feather. But for now, I'm just going to go throughout and add in the black tones to those darkest areas. I am going to be very light with this. And as always, I have attached the initial sketch so that you guys can follow along with this piece and have a accurate starting point. It's really important to start with a great initial sketch that will really set you up for a great drawing. Some areas aren't going to be as dark as others, so for some areas you might need more black, and for others you might just need a little bit. So I'm just focusing on getting in all of those darkest shadows between the feathers. And there is these dark shadows between your feathers because of the fact that basically the feather on top, say we take this feather, it is on top of obviously a feather underneath it. And so the feather underneath is going to have a darker shadow because this top feather is like getting rid of, it's stopping the light being able to get through to the feather underneath. And so the feather underneath is getting less light, so it appears darker. So for example, with this big feather here, this feather is on top of these two feathers. So this feather is getting a lot more of the light, and so when it's overlapping these feathers, it's stopping them feathers from getting that light. So the areas just underneath this feather, so right around the edges where those two feathers meet, on the underneath feathers, they are going to be a lot darker. And by getting these shadows in the right place, you will get that look of layering and depth within your feathers. Some of these shadows will be done with just our darker colours. For example, I'll just be using the Indian red for some of these. There isn't too much dark shadow up here. And I am working my way from the top corner, going all the way over to finally leading me to this corner over here. And I am having very clean lines around the edge of the feathers. So there are two different types of edges. You can either have a soft gradient and change between the values, or a harsh line, a harsh edge as well. And so basically a harsh edge is where you have a very abrupt change in colour and value, whereas a gradient is where it's a softer transition. And so normally it will be a softer gradient if you can see the whole of the surface. So for example, if we take this feather here, you can see that there's a lot of shadow changes, and all of the shadow changes within one of the feathers are very gradual and very soft. Whereas the edge between this feather and the feather underneath is very sharp. And so you have very sharp edges where you have objects like overlapping each other. So if there's something in front of something else, then you're going to have a harsh edge between those two things. That's why the edge of the feathers tend to have quite a harsh cut-off point between the values and between the colour changes, but within the actual feathers it's fairly soft changes throughout. So most of these feathers aren't just like smooth all the way around. There are these little, what are they called? Little juts, and I don't know what they're called. I don't know. I can't find the word. Little slits in the feathers all the way around. With this technique, you don't have to apply any pressure, which means this is a great technique if you find that your wrists ache if you use the burnishing technique. I know my wrists ache if I burnish too much. It can become very, very sort of taxing on your wrists. That's why I love this method of using the solvent. It also gets rid of any graininess, so don't worry about the white grain of the pencil, the white grain of the paper showing through. That will be removed when we blend with the solvent. And I also love how vibrant it makes all of the colours look. As you can see, I'm just looking at each feather at a time and getting in the shape of where the darkest shadows are. And that's really important. You really need to look at the shape of these shadows because they do correspond normally to the feather that's on top, because I just said about the fact that the cast shadows are going to go on the feathers underneath because the top feather is stopping the light from getting to those areas. So the shadows are normally pretty much the shape of the feather on top. So it's that curve. It curves round with the top feather. And those shadows, the shapes of them are very important in order to make it look realistic, in order to make it look like a cast shadow. And these cast shadows do not have harsh edges, so I want to soften that out. But the edges between the feathers are harsh. Because like I said, you have a harsh edge where something's overlapping something else. So again, this cast shadow is following the shape of the feather on top. So I created basic line to help guide me, and then I'm just shading in where that shadow is. Same on this side. And you can layer even more of the black where the shadow is the most intense and the darkest, without applying too much pressure. If you apply too much pressure, then you're flattening out the tooth of the paper. And when you flatten out of the tooth of the paper, it means it's harder to then add more layers on top because the paper can no longer grip to it. So continue to do this process throughout the whole of the study. I also really like to get in the darkest areas first, because if you've watched my other tutorials, I talk about this all of the time. I like to get in the darkest areas first because I find that it helps me to judge the other colours and values. Once I've got the darkest areas in, it's then easier to judge how dark everything else needs to go compared to that. Because often if you don't have the darkest areas in and you're working on, say, the lighter areas, you may think you're going too dark. I know, for example, if I was to do the white of the eye first and you add in grey tones, you may add in greys and think, oh, that looks too dark because the rest of the paper's white. But then once you start to add in the really dark values around it, you realise that your values that you did for the white of the eye weren't dark enough, for example. It's up to you though, everybody's different. You may like working from light to dark and not doing it this way. If you have no preference or you've never tried coloured pencil, it's your first time trying, then I would recommend trying it this way and see how you like it. And then if you don't like it, then you can look up new ways. If you don't like using the solvent, then you can look at my tutorials where I don't use the solvent. But if you have no experience yet, then try this way, see how you like it. I'd love to know in the comment section how you found this technique. Did you enjoy doing it this way? I always find this fairly therapeutic and relaxing to do it this way, because I just can shade it in. I don't have to worry about burnishing anything, and I know the solvent works really nicely and gives it a really nice painterly style to it, which I love a lot. So getting in this dark shadow here. This part should be fairly easy to do if you've got a really nice, accurate sketch. If you also want to practice your sketching so that you can do really nice, accurate sketches on your own with the projects that you want to give a go, then I do have sketching tutorials, so you can follow along with them. where I show the grid method. My personal favourite method of using reference points to help you, as well as another freehanding method. So now I'm just looking around each of the feathers. I think I'm pretty happy with all of the areas that I've got in so far. I don't think that there's many more. I'm just looking around because I've probably missed some areas. So just scan around the image. It doesn't matter if you have, because you can always come back and add black to any other shadows that you find. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that for now. So I'm going to leave the black pencil and we're going to start to add in some red tones. So I'm going to switch over to my poppy red and we're going to start to layer the red all of the way around on the red feathers. So I like to hold my pencil further to the back and use the side of the pencil to help shade an area, especially larger areas, faster. If you hold it to the front, then it's going to take you a lot longer, and also you're more likely to apply too much pressure to the pencil. Obviously use whatever's comfortable to you, but I found that this is the easiest way for me to go in and just shade in large areas really nice and evenly. Just going to shade all the way across this area, and you will see me switch over to my Indian red to add some shading where we can see those darker shadows. So up here I'm just going to add some of that Indian red, and even when you're getting in the shadows, still keep it nice and light. You can add some of the red over all of these black areas as well. So I'm just shading the red there, the Indian red, for all of these shadows within the red area. And go in again, add some more of the poppy red. Just layer it all over this area, shading all of the way across. Just lightly. Lightly adding a layer of the poppy red all over these red feathers. So I'm being very light because I will be building up more red in a second, but you can see that in some of the red feathers we have lighter areas. am, however, going in and adding slightly darker areas just to help indicate where the different feathers are. And I will leave areas, for example down here, where it's yellow instead of the red. But apart from that, I'm just going in and lightly shading all of the red feathers. Remember to erase your sketch outline for areas that are really light. So for example, with these yellow areas, if you've got your sketch outline too dark, just to indicate where the yellow is going to start, then make sure you erase the sketch outlines that you've done in graphite before you actually go in and add the yellow. Otherwise, the graphite sketch will show through your yellow shading, and that won't look too great. Just keep shading. Looking down here now, need to add all of the red feathers over here. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the top and just now start adding even more layering for our darker red areas, basically all of the areas but those highlighted ones. So even the shadows within these slightly lighter red feathers, the shadows are just the same colour as the poppy red. So the shadows for these areas are pretty much the same as the colour for these feathers over here, because this has got very light pink tone to it, light reddy pink as the main colour. So remember, you're adding this to every area of the red feathers but the lightest areas, but the highlighted areas. So for example, feathers like this just need to be shaded in everywhere. There is a slight highlight in this corner. That's about it. So I'm adding this value all of the way across. So this feather here has some more red underneath because of that cast shadow, and then we don't want to add anywhere the yellow is going to be, or where this highlight is right at the top. But everywhere else we're adding an extra layer too. Down here we just need to shade all of this in. Let the red go over into the black to help transition, because at the end of the day these shadows are just shadows, really dark shadows of the feathers. Moving back over to this feather. Again, there's quite a lot of red on this feather. It's going into the yellows at the end, so we're going to leave those areas white. I'm going to shade in this whole area with a lot more red. It's quite solid red. Keep going from different directions to help build up more layers of colour, because when you go from different directions it means that the tip of the paper is picking the pencil up from different angles to give more of an intense colour. Makes it more saturated without having to apply any more pressure. Now to get in the darkest areas within the red feathers, I'm going in with my Indian red and just shading this for the darkest areas within the red feathers, also using it as a transition shade from the black areas into our reddy toned areas. And because we want to make the feathers pop, we need to add in the shadows. Otherwise it's just going to end up looking flat. Especially if you don't add any tones over the black areas as well. So within this feather, you can see a slight cast shadow from those feathers above. So this part up here, this top part, is going to be in a slightly bit more shadow. So I'm adding a little bit of Indian red right at the top of this feather to help give it more of a cast shadow, and also to add the little stem vein bit in the middle. It's also casting a shadow on the feather below that one. So I'm just shading in a bit more shadow for that. Just shading as well, just over the black to transition them more. Now I'm going to add some Indian red on this feather. This feather and this feather here, these two, are casting shadows onto this feather below, stopping it from getting the light, so it is darker. So I'm just adding some shading in with our Indian red, and you can see that our shadow has got a bit of a curve to it. So we're going to curve it round slightly. Now this feather is getting a slight cast shadow from the feather above, only very, very slightly, so just adding a very light layer of the Indian red. This large feather has got again a cast shadow, normally next to the areas where you've got that black already shaded in. Let me just mute this. Okay. Once again, there's a darker stem in the middle of this feather. Going over to this side, there's quite a bit of shadow over on this area. It's in quite a bit more shadow, especially this small slither of red feather we can see. So that's all I'm going to do for now for those areas. Now I'm going to move on to the yellow, and we're going to start to add the yellow throughout these red feathers, where there's a bit of bit of yellow on the tips of the feathers. This feather has got a lot of yellow on the end. It's even going into some green. And I am using lines to get this shading in, because if you look closely you can see that there is little lines. They are in little, the feathers are made up of tiny little feathers which are in lines. And this yellow is very nice and vibrant, really does stand out. Shading it in all of these areas that are yellow. And this is our lightest value, so we will be adding other shadows and shading in a second. So let's go over the whole of this large feather with the lemon yellow. So I'm going to even layer a bit of the yellow on these feathers, because even though they are green, it's a very limey green, so that green does have a lot of yellow within it. So I just want to shade a light bit of yellow over these areas. Just looking around, seeing where else we can see subtle hints of yellow. I think that's pretty much it. Now we're going to move on to adding some sunburst yellow. So this is a slightly darker value. This is what we're going to use for the shadows within the yellow areas, or to tie the red in with the yellow. So as you can see, I'm going over the red and the yellow to create more of a natural transition. This is like a very dark yellow, light orangey colour. So you can shade it for the shadows within the yellow areas, which again are going to be from cast shadows from the feathers above, using lines to get this in. I'm also going to go in with the goldenrod as another shadowed colour. And this is a less vibrant orangey tone. This is a great colour for the cast shadows. Now let's work on these blue feathers down here, and I'm going to start off with the colour Caribbean Sea, and we're going to lightly layer this over the top of all of the blue feathers. But within these blue feathers there is a lot of green and even other colours as well, so we won't be overlapping while laying this down everywhere on the blue feathers, just the actual blue parts. And it doesn't matter if it's a shadowed area, I'm just going to start by laying this down on every area that's blue. So I'm looking at it one feather at a time. So let's look at this feather up here. We can see that it normally is within the centre of each feather, where we can see those different colours. I'm shading it a little bit over where the green is going to be, so that those areas tie and knit really well together. Now we've got a very blue feather here, so we're going to be adding a lot more of this colour within this area, within this feather. Again, you can add it in lines. There's even a bit of blue at the top of this lime green feather. Now let's go in with the darker blue. This is the denim blue, and let's start to layer this for the shadows within those blue feathers. So we're going to mainly overlap this onto the black areas, and any areas you think need to go darker. But definitely overlap it over the top of the black, so that it's not just a flat black, it then starts to look a bit more, have a bit more depth to it. Throughout this bottom feather we need to add quite a lot of this blue. It's very dark. This area here is very dark as well. Add the denim blue to every area that's got a cast shadow. And remember, within a feather, all of the changes in value are very soft and gradual. There's no harsh edges. Now let's go in with our green tones. I'm going to start with the apple green, which is our lightest green. And let's start by shading this across all of the areas that have got more of a green tinge to them. So there's going to be a lot of this green on this area, but as it is a lime green, we will be mixing even more yellow over the top. There's some green at the tip of this feather. Now let's go in with the darker green and use this for the dark green, the shadows within the green areas. Again, remember, it's always a softer transition. Try and think when you're shading in the shadows, why is that shadow there in the first place? Is the area turning away from the light or being blocked so the light can't get to it? This area is a cast shadow, so that's why the shadow is there, because the light is being blocked. So I'm adding the darker green onto the end of this feather. Now I'm going to go in with my darkest blue. This is the indigo blue, and use this for the darkest areas. And I will need to add more black to these areas as well. So now you can see over here, this has got a very orangey tone. So I'm going to first add the cadmium orange hue to this area, overlapping it slightly into the green, and on this feather tends to be by the stems. And I'm also going to go in with the poppy red and add a bit of that on there too. We're going to go back in with the lemon yellow and add even more yellow throughout these lime green feathers. Make sure there's enough pigment down, otherwise if there's not enough pigment down on any of the feathers, then it just simply won't blend as well. Now let's go in with the black and start to add even more shadows. Really build up those values, that contrast. So look between each of the feathers, look for these cast shadows. Now looking back around the feathers, I'm just going to make the odd adjustments now. I want to add more red tone up here. And I'm going to go in with the Caput Mortem Violet and layer that colour up here as well. All around this area where these shadows are. Add some more of the blue. And we're going to layer in some more of the green as well. Let's go in with our Sunburst Yellow and a bit of the Goldenrod. Remember, this is great for our cast shadows. Now just before we go in with the solvent, I just want to add a little bit of white pencil to all of the areas that haven't got much coloured pencil down because they are slightly lighter, just so that when we blend, everything still comes out nice and smooth. so mainly just up here. Okay, so I'm going to go in my Zest-It pencil blend on my Filbert brush. This is the Daler Rowney Filbert brush, and I'm just going to be dipping this in my Zest-It pencil blend. You can use whatever solvent you want. You can use paint thinner, Gamsol. I know that the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner is quite popular, and you don't have to like blot too much of it off. You can use a little bit more with this first layer that we're doing, and I'm just going in and just use the brush to help blend all of the coloured pencil out, and it will give it a really nice vibrant look to it. Just blends everything nicely together, gives it a really painterly look, and then we can build up the details over the top. So I like to go in little circular motions. So if you blend a really dark area, like say if you blend the black area and then you know you're going to be blending yellow next, make sure you clean that brush before you go and blend out the yellow area, otherwise it will all just bleed into each other. And you will have to wait for this to dry once we've blended it out. You don't have to wait too long, about 10 minutes will do. I normally leave mine a little bit longer just to be on the safe side. Because if you go in with colour pencil again whilst the paper is too wet, then the problem you'll have is because the paper's wet, it's in more of a fragile state. It's a little bit soggier. So it's more fragile, which means that it could rip or get damaged a bit more easier. So just wait for it to dry. So keep going until everything's blended out. Okay, now that we're all nicely blended out, wait for this to dry and then we'll come back and add the final little details. Now that we've let everywhere dry, I'm going to go in first of all with my white pencil, and we're going to start to use this to not only add the highlights but add any details like the little frilly bits and all of that stuff. We can go over then those highlights and tone them with other colours. For example, with the yellow we might need to add the little frilly lines and then go over them with yellow to tone them. So make sure all of your pencils are nice and sharp, because this is the stage where we're going to add all of the final highlights and details. And look at each feather in turn and identify where the highlights are within that feather and start to get in any of the little frilly bits, because each feather is made up of lots of these little feathers. So add some white over the top of the black to create these little lines. And follow the curvature of the feather when you're doing this. So this will help them look more realistic, because they won't just have blunt cut off edges. They'll be more feathered in. No pun intended. Okay. I'm shading in some of the white as well over for these highlights. And don't worry if your highlights become too light, because again, like I said, we can go over them and tone them with the reds and all of the colours that we need to. It's just about getting in the details for the moment. So I'm not just going to be going throughout the red feathers, I'm going to be going throughout all of the feathers and doing this. Keep looking around the feathers you've previously done, see if you can spot anything that you need to tweak. So I'm going to add all of these lines on the feathers. You can see on the reference there, each of the feathers, there's lots of these lines that are making it up. And they are going in a certain direction, so I'm following that direction. Just to add a bit more texture to these feathers. Getting in details on the feathers is what's going to make them look even more realistic. So remember, we are adding lots of highlights at the moment, so it might start to look a bit too light because we need to then go in and start to add in the shadows as well. So for now we're just getting in all of the brightest areas and just getting in that texture. A lot of this that we're doing with the white, we will be covering and glazing over the top with other colours. It's just about getting in that texture for now as well. This feather was split into some little bits up here, so I just went over the top and added this white area, and again I know that's too light, but we can go in with our lighter yellows and greens to tone over the top, and then it will look really, really good. So already you can see that our feathers now have a lot more detail to them. They're looking a lot more realistic. Okay, now let's go in with the poppy red and start to add another layer of red to our red feathers. Any areas we feel like need to be smoothed out or need a bit more saturation added into them. Or if you want to glaze it over any of these little white details we've added in. And go ahead. A lot of these feathers have solid colour, so I'm just making sure they look nice and solid. Okay, most of these feathers around here have quite a solid colour, so I'm going to go in little lines as I try and get this in now, just to give it a bit more texture rather than just colouring it in and making it just a block colour. And it should go on really easy, this colour now that we've blended it out with the solvent. The second layer of coloured pencil normally goes on really nicely. As you can see, I did add a layer of tape around the outside to create a really nice border for this piece. And when I'm using solvent, I do like to use tape to create borders so that everything is nice and neat and you don't have to worry when you're using your solvent and blending it out. You don't have to worry about smearing it everywhere. It gives a really nice crisp edge to your drawings. Now I'm going to go in with the Indian red and start to get in the shadows again. So I'm basically just doing the same thing as last time, just again and creating more definition. Shading over the top of that black again. Getting in all of the cast shadows. Even adding a bit more contrast than is in the reference. So I'm going to add the Indian red over the top of the black in this area. And I'm happy with the shadow that we've added to the red feathers so far. I hope you guys are happy with how yours is looking. Now I'm going to go in with yellow and start to add that throughout this feather, using quite a bit of pressure, just because I want it to really show up and look really vibrant. I'm going to quickly switch over to a blue tone. There is a bit of blue in between the edge of the feathers, so I just want to add that in. And carry on getting in the yellow tones. Now I'm going to switch over to the golden rod, and this is for those shadows within the yellow feathers. Quite a lot of shadow at the top here. Quickly going back in with the yellow, need to apply more pressure here. Now I'm going to go in with the sunburst yellow. Just add this in a couple of places. Okay, now let's switch over to our dark green. I want to get in some of these darker green areas. Using lines because we want to try and get the detail in for each of these feathers now. Now I'm switching over to my darker blue pencil, and I'm just using this is the indigo blue, and I'm just using this to shade in some of those darker blue shadows within our blue feathers. We can also switch between this and our lighter blue, as we do need to get in some more of this light blue value. So switch between that and our darker blue. You can choose to work on it colour at a time or feather at a time if you want to. So I'm doing a little bit of both. Okay, so I'm pressing nice and hard on our indigo blue to really get in that contrast, and I want to add a nice clean edge around the edge of the feathers, just to really make that pop out of the page. So I'm just going around all of the blue feathers. You can see just how much darker the second layer is and how easy it is to get those darker values once you've blended with the solvent. I'm loving how vibrant this is looking, and it looks really nice and colourful. Transition into this lighter area. Adding a lot more of the darker blue for this feather. So I need to add a lot more of the darker blue around here, but I'm going to switch over to the denim blue because it's not that dark, it's more of a mid-tone. Just bringing it all the way up the side. Gets lighter in the middle, near the stem. So I'm feathering it in towards that point. Going over the top with my lighter blue. You can even, if you want, take your solvent, your brush, not add any more solvent to it, and with the little bit of solvent that's still on it, it will really nicely smooth all of that out, as you can see. You can use it to smooth out any areas you want that have got a bit more of that grainy look, and you don't really have to wait for it to dry because there's so little on that brush. And you can go straight back over the top of that area. It just really helps to easily blend them to all of that area together. I'm going to add some more of the green on top of this feather. I'm pressing slightly harder to get some variation, to get some slightly darker strokes. And as you can see, I'm still doing lines to help give the texture of the feather. Going in with my dark green. Do the same thing. I'm going to add some of the light green over this feather again, using the lines. And on this feather up here, also pressing hard on the yellow. Now I'm going to go in with the goldenrod, because this feather is a lot less vibrant. Adding the tips of the feathers using the green pencil. I'm going to switch over to using the Caput Mortem Violet, and I'm going to go over the shadowed areas amongst the red feathers using this to give a more natural look and to tone it in with the red feathers a bit better. I'm also going to switch over to using the black pencil to get in some of those darker shades. So I'm going to layer in some more black and then blend over it with the Caput Mortem Violet. So glazing over that with our more natural tone. I'm going to go ahead and do this for all of these darkest values, and adding these really dark shadows in is just going to make this pop so much more. Just adding a bit more shadow with the Indian red. Switch back over to the black as well. I also want to add more orange to the centre of this feather and also some of the red. So now I'm just creating more of an edge for some of these feathers. If it isn't so obvious in the drawing where the edge of the feathers are, I'm just going in and adding some more shadow to make it more of a definitive change between the feathers. Now I'm going to go over the top, like I said, over the black with that Caput Mortem violet. Wipe away the bits. So I'm really happy with how this is looking. Just looking around, seeing if I want to make any other little adjustments before I call it finished. So anyway guys, that is it for this tutorial. I really hope you found it useful and picked up some tips on how to draw feathers in the future, no matter what your reference is. Some things to look out for, like the cast shadows and creating the little feathery bits by adding the little details with the white pencil and glazing over the top. But I'll see you guys in the final part when we'll be working on the dog's ear. And now if I take this tape off, you'll see the really nice edge that it creates. So, such a nice, clean, crisp edge. I just think it looks so nice and it's so satisfying to take off the tape. I think this is probably my favourite part of doing good drawing or painting, is seeing that really clean edge. Okay. If there's any bits on your work, then you can use a kneaded eraser just to pick them up. So I'll see you guys in the final part. Bye everybody.